When you said sexual fawning,
Mhm.
I don't think I've heard that before. And I had a very visceral reaction. I felt my chest get hot, everything just kind of like flush. Would you mind going into that just a little bit?
Yes. And I guess I would ask, would we be willing to slow that down just with you and I for a moment? Because this happens, particularly with every woman that I have said those words, sexual fawning. There is a recognition there. And they go, I know what you're talking about. Not to totally put you on the spot, but I'm totally putting you on the spot after you shared the hotness in your chest. I'm interested in what does that evoke for you in addition to the somatic resonance?
We'll make it out and fall in love tonight.
Well, Ingrid, we're incredibly excited to chat with you. We have been like super anxious, not in a bad way. Excited. Yeah, very, very excited to chat with you. I found your content, I don't even remember when. I've been following you for many, many years and super big fan of everything that you share and all the stuff that you put out into the world. And I'm excited to get into a whole bunch of different topics with you today. But before we do all of those kind of things, I really think it would be important to, let's see. Like when you think about your story, like I've been thinking a lot about stories lately and how we tell our stories over and over and over again, right?
Yeah,
And they become like a version of us that we carry around and share with people.
Mm-hmm.
What's an aspect of your story that you feel like you have seen behind the curtain of almost, like the part of it that has changed and evolved in the last few years that is different than you might have originally thought that it was?
I mean, I think the caption of that would be, I didn't know. Despite all my attempts at knowing and decades of sobriety and every self-help program and 3 degrees in psychology and written books. And, you know, I did all the things, sat on a million therapy couches trying to know. And what I didn't know is that I had complex trauma. And I specialized in trauma. But, you know, my trauma wasn't real trauma, right? It was like all that minimization. I didn't know that that was blocking me from seeing the truth. And so, you know, since you've probably encountered me on Instagram or, you know, all the other places, it's been this journey of knowing and claiming and owning and sharing for all the people that have been carrying around that same, like, not me, right? It wasn't that bad. I think that's the heart of it.
When was the first point where you had awareness of like, oh, wait a minute, maybe it was a little bit worse than I thought it was? Like I've got a version of my childhood that I carried around for a really long time where it was like, oh, it wasn't that bad, right? Some key points that kind of stood out, but for the most part, it was like a really great childhood. And then there came a point where it was like, actually, there's a whole other version of my childhood that I've started to look at and make peace with that is completely different. Was there a moment in time where that kind of happened for you as well? And maybe not just with childhood, but life.
Yeah. I wouldn't say one moment. I'd say it's been a series of moments. Like I knew as a child that something was wrong. I organized an intervention with social services for my family when I was in high school, right? But it's been at every step. The response has made me go, oh, I was wrong, right? Or it must be me, or I'm broken, which is that big piece with complex trauma. So, you know, I did the intervention. I was told, Ingrid, you know, you're being sort of ridiculous. You're making this all up. I don't believe you. You know, fast forward, you know, many, many years later, I'm in recovery and I'm working on myself and I got to look at my part, my side of the street. And you can't take someone else's inventory. There's this idea that like, you can sort of filter all your relational trauma, just metabolize it through your own body and right? Like no one is the wiser. And that was, of course, very appealing, right? Like if I say the right prayers and be a good girl, you know, I'm going to transcend all of this. And of course, that didn't happen. And then I go to graduate school and I'm in a training. This was like 20 years ago now with Bessel van der Kolk. He came to do a trauma training at this inpatient treatment center that I was working at the time. And he started to tell a case study of my story. And I'm sitting in this pretty small room with these other clinicians. I feel like I was probably sweating and shrinking as I've just, you know, I called it like the incredible shrinking therapist. I wanted to disappear because I was there to be a therapist. And here he was telling my story. And that was the first inkling where I was like, well, maybe this is trauma, right? But then I went back to our lovely DSM, the diagnostic manual in the US that tells us like what's legitimate or not and how it is. And I didn't meet the criteria, right? I was like, flashbacks? I don't have flashbacks, or all of these other things. So again, it's just been at every turn. Again, lots of therapist couches. No one ever named complex trauma for me. So it's been all these attempts, now that I think about it out loud, to look to somebody else to say, am I valid? Is this valid? Is this real? And what changed it all, it's why I called my memoir Believing Me, is I stopped waiting for anybody else to validate it, whether that's the people that hurt me, the people that denied that people hurt me, any of the therapists, even the mental health field, right? There's no diagnosis to this day for complex PTSD in the US. And I'm like, well, guess what? I have it. So it's real. It's legitimate. It lives inside my body. And I'm not going to let anything get in the way of me finally, all these decades later, healing from that. And that was such a long answer to your very brief question.
It's a beautiful answer, though, because I think that it highlights so important, that key spot of like, you don't need permission to claim these parts of yourself. And it's, I can relate so much to that thing of like looking, all over the place. A lot of the times it was looking to Steph to validate my experience and to tell me that this was this and that was that. And same thing with parents or with society or with therapists. And at some point it was very much that same thing where it was like, I don't need anybody else to tell me what's true for me. Mm-hmm. And that awareness has helped me so much, just in the sense of like, almost like a guidepost, because I'll continually navigate the confusion around things all the time. And it'll still be a struggle for me to kind of make sense of trauma, make sense of my past, even just in the present moment a lot of times. And it's like, well, it doesn't need to be validated by anybody other than me. And that's enough.
It's so true. And I guess I just want to name that is a radical shift. And I think part of what, my current focus is on now, the reason that it's so huge is because we're ultimately talking about is the Fawn response, the fawning trauma response, where our safety, our relational safety, right, rested in the hands of other people. And so we were conditioned to look outward. There was no bodily autonomy, especially if you're talking about childhood trauma. We're dependent on our caregivers. We are hardwired for attachment, right? So my whole body knew, right? I just told you all the times that I sort of was looking for help, asking for help, and no help came. And so what my body learned to do was reflexively like appease and, people please, and the codependent piece. And so I come by those things very honestly. And so I also I guess I don't want to minimize that it's just as simple as like a cognitive decision. Like, come on, just set a boundary, just love yourself, because the truth is that stuff is so hard when you're breaking free from a lifetime of conditioning where your body literally says, I can't decide. I'll be worse off if I step out. It's like stepping out on a plank, knowing they're just going to push you into the ocean, right? So it's a yes and. Yes, it's that simple, and it's that freaking hard.
Yes. Your journey with Believing Me and getting to that point where you said you weren't writing that for anybody else. It was for you. You were believing you in that space, in that journey, and then tying that into the fawning response. I'm curious. So when you have a lifetime of this and you're just getting to the point of where you're really starting to believe you, which is like right there, like that can just be right there is everything, believing you.
Yeah.
But we are so ingrained, or if you are in this situation where you're so ingrained with the fawning response and you're taking this part, how do you navigate when you're finally believing you?
Yeah.
And you're getting different perceptions, because everybody has their own perception of their reality. Everybody has their own story. So while you're believing you and you're also working on validating somebody else's experience, how do you hold both where you're not denying somebody else's feelings of reality and you're also not denying yours? And I'm not talking in a blatant, like a parent-child situation or where
Mhm.
you're like, this happened and you're, no, you didn't. But like, say you're with a coworker, a friend, a partner, when they're like, this is my experience, and you are validating your own experience. How do you navigate that in the way where both can be true,
Yeah.
their experience, but you're not looking at minimizing and taking your away. You're still believing you
Yeah.
and your feelings.
I think that's real black belt stuff that you're talking about in my experience, right? Because I think because this stuff is so hard and so tricky, I almost say at the beginning, you just do whatever you have to do to hold on to your experience. And for me, if I was trying to hold nuance and trying to hold like, well, this is also true for you, whatever the context was, it immediately derailed me, right? If there was any conflict or contrast there, my body said, whoop, I got to take one for the team, right? So it basically kept me locked in. And so I would say don't start with trying to think about holding all the pieces. I'd say go to a really safe, quiet space. For me, it was at this kitchen table where I'm sitting at right now, where I started to write. It was often at 3 a.m. and it was just for me. How do I actually feel? What's happening in my body right now? What feels true, right? And I'll say this to clients all the time. Take physical space from the people, the places that trigger you. It might even just be in your personal therapy, right? It's like start in the safest, smallest, precious little, I'm thinking of that Baby Bumblebee song as I'm doing this with my hands, but it's just like, and then once you have that space, it becomes possible to grow this. And ultimately, yes, at the end of the day, we're hoping to get where we're not living in this binary world all the time, which is what we're doing when we're dysregulated all the time with complex trauma. It's either I'm safe or I'm unsafe, right? It's I'm right or I'm wrong. We tend to get into this black and white thinking. So it's such a great point that you're making. But I guess just to give yourself a lot of grace and compassion that it's going to be a process. And I think we can get there, but I push it sort of like way to the end of the line, really, because it takes a while to inhabit your own body. And then once you've inhabited your own body, it's suddenly like, I'm a real person. Oh my gosh, you're a real person too. We can both be whole people together. But when you can't even inhabit your whole body, right? You're literally just a shell. To continue to orient to like, what do you need? What might you be? And I'm not saying we become assholes, right? But like, to prioritize that I'm finding my voice. And especially if it's a partner or a friend, you might even say, hey, I'm working on taking up space and finding my voice. And it might not even be that graceful all the time. So can you forgive me in advance? I'm really trying to have opinions and assert myself and hold on to myself. And the safe people can hold that space for you, but it's full of growing pains, right? Like
All of it.
Yeah.
Okay. So much later on. Well, if we were to back that up a bit, how did you, or maybe you knew it right out of the gate. I didn't. I understood first it was the fight, flight, or freeze, the trauma responses. And then when fawning came in, it was almost, I didn't know how it fit in really.
Yeah.
Which is funny because that's me.
That's your
like, and I'm like, I don't really know how that fits in. And then people pleasing.
Yeah.
I thought they were two completely different things. I remember Craig, putting these pieces together and I'm like, how are those the same? Those aren't the same. So when we're looking at that and seeing two very different things here, how did you make that connection, or how would you explain that to somebody so they can start to put their pieces together?
Today's episode of the podcast is brought to you by Woolly. We absolutely love Woolly, and they're a longtime sponsor of this podcast. We're currently 100% decked out in all Woolly right now, and truthfully, it's how we walk around most days.
Woolly is made from 100% merino wool, which is known for its natural softness, which it is so soft, and that's really important. As well, we're being healthier. I don't want it to feel scratchy or itchy. They're easy to care for, machine washable, because out of all the places that I'm spending my time, I don't want it to be spent on laundry.
Woolly has a wide variety of men and women's clothing, everything from socks, underwear, tops, bottoms, pants, leggings. What else, babe?
Did you say underwear and nice hoodies?
Another thing that I really love about Woolly is if it gets wet, you actually stay dry. All their clothes are sustainable and eco-friendly.
And because they're 100% merino wool, they're natural moisture wicking, which means they're not sticking to you and feeling gross.
Listeners of the podcast get an exclusive discount of 15% off of everything at Woolly. Head to the link in our description.
And be sure to enter the code Steph and Craig at checkout to get that 15% off.
So go get yourself some socks. Go get yourself some underwear. Again, that code is Steph and Craig. Save 15%.
Yeah, you are not alone. I think the whole field has been confused. I think the Fawn response has gone missing for everyone, and yet it probably is the most pervasive of them all, right? Because we've all been children at one point in time. We all live in hierarchies and structures of power, whether it's at your work or, whatever, right? My understanding of it is, and this is why I love the lens and the language of trauma to begin with, is that it puts things back in our body, right? It relates to our physiology. It relates to this most primitive and yet genius life-saving part of ourselves that just reacts, right? Instinctually. Okay, it's life or death out there. I have to do whatever I have to do to keep myself safe. And particularly when you're a child, you don't really have the option to fight back. Even me trying to find my voice with social services, it didn't work. It made things worse, right? So the body remembers, the fight response makes things worse. Okay, then as a child, where are you going to run? Where are you going to run long term, right? You oftentimes end up having to go back home and freeze. Although I have my experiences of freeze, it's also like, but I also have to live in this environment day in, day out. And so my understanding of the Fawn response is that it's a hybrid response. And I think this is in part also why it's gone missing for so long, is that it's one part fight flight, right? That's the sympathetic, active, mobilizing part of the trauma response. This is the part that is more visible. It's the part that you can see. It's the pleasing. It's the caretaking. It's the no big deal, right? It's like, I got it. That's the active part of the Fawn response. But at the same time, there's a parasympathetic response happening. This is the part that's harder to see. It's the depression, it's the dissociation, it's the down regulation where we disconnect from ourselves. So I'm really connected to you, but I become so disconnected from myself, I might not even be able to notice that abuse is happening at all. There's this numbing, right? At the end of that spectrum of the parasympathetic is the submit or the collapse response where the body can even just play dead, right? So with fawning, there's this genius thing where it's happening at the same time. Now, when we look at that and all the different ways that it can present, to me, the fawn response is the heartbeat of people pleasing or even codependency. But to me, when I finally saw it in the lens and language of trauma, it's the thing that allowed me to make sense to myself. Again, going back to this idea of like, well, Steph just set healthy boundaries, right? It makes such rational sense. Who wouldn't want to like grow their self-esteem and have more worth and take care of themselves and set healthy boundaries? But when you are in the double bind, which we were put in with the fawning trauma response, you have two choices. It's safety or self. And guess what the body's going to choose? It's safety. It's safety every time. So when you're sitting there looking at me and making a great case for like, why wouldn't I just choose myself? Of course, intellectually, I'm going, that's what I'm trying to do. But my body still feels unsafe. And now I go, oh, okay. So if this is a trauma response, I have to stop trying to muscle my way through with my intellect and shaming myself like, well, come on, just get it together. Everyone else makes it sound so simple. And I go, no, there's some stuff stored in my body that is unresolved. And this is where the work ultimately lies, right? It's like Fawning it gives us the depth, I think, and the breadth of something that we've kind of been talking about for a long time, but I think just using the best language that we had at the time, but it was kind of insufficient as far as I'm concerned. So I made sense to myself when I finally saw all of these behaviors in the context of a trauma response.
I made sense to myself.
Yeah.
That's such a great, that's a point right there. I made sense to myself. I love that. I just felt that I made sense to myself.
Yes. And that's the thing it's why I'm having this conversation. It's why I go on Instagram. It's why I lead with my survivorship more than my credentials, right? It's why I wrote a memoir. And why I'm now really writing about fawning is because I want everybody else to make sense to themselves too. There is you can just exhale, I saw you do it, right? I saw you slow down and kind of come into your own body. I just want us all to have that experience. And it's not an efforting, come on, it's I can relax into the fullness of, honestly, the genius that is my body that did exactly what it was designed to do in those situations. And I don't have to beat myself up for it.
So once we have awareness of it, so somebody that's listening to the podcast right now and they're putting some pieces together and they're thinking about fawning in a different way, maybe, right? And understanding it a little bit differently. What are some key things that maybe, I know we've talked a little bit about people pleasing and codependency, but how does it manifest in those type of dynamics? I guess I could speak about because we both do it pretty regularly. It's a pretty go-to coping mechanism for both of us.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, and it's funny too, Ingrid, because it's been coming up lately. I actually had awareness of it. I don't remember. It was yesterday or the day before or something like that. I'll immediately start to get into that people-pleasing mindset where I'm prioritizing Stephanie's emotions over mine. And then I have to catch that and recognize, wait a minute, I'm doing that thing again where I'm worried about how she's feeling or what mood she's in and how she's moving through the day. And then I set the tone for my day based off of that.
Yeah.
And it's I can't do that anymore. I was literally repeating the mantra to myself this morning where it was I'm not responsible for other people's emotions.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not responsible for other people's emotions. It's constantly having to remind myself of that.
Yes.
But what are some other ways that you've seen or experienced of how people will get stuck in the fawn response? And so that way, hopefully, if they're listening, they can kind of catch it and see it so that they can start to make some of the shifts that I also want to talk about. What do we do about it once we figure it out, right?
Yeah. That was such a great example. Thanks for sharing that. And I think, what you're speaking to is, at first, it's just an unconscious response. We don't know that we're doing it. But when you invite more consciousness, you can start to catch it. But at first, we catch it after the fact, right? And so to me, this is when we go, oh, I did it again. Oops, I did it again. Because eventually you're going to go, oops, I almost did it, right? You'll find a different choice point there. And the thing that you said where you go, so I set all my needs or feelings aside, and it's all about Steph. And what you're pointing to there, which is the cost of the fawn response. It's no matter how we do it, if we're morphing our personality to be something more agreeable to somebody, or if we're minimizing our feelings because I don't really exist, the thread through all of the symptoms is self-abandonment. I don't exist, right? I don't exist. And so one thing that I do spontaneously all the time, but I encourage my clients to do it, is just literally put their hand on their heart. And I love it. When a baby is born, they have you put the baby on your chest, skin to skin. And we do that because it releases oxytocin, you put the baby in the crook of your neck. So we can release oxytocin, this feel good, bonding, yummy hormone, by ourselves, for ourselves. You put your hand on your heart, skin to skin if you can. And it's just a stance of self-compassion. It makes me take a spontaneous deep breath like it just did. And I go, oh, I am here, right? It's just this I am here. And other ways that we can pay attention to ourselves. that can help regulate our nervous system. For me, I love it's walking, it's music, it's hiking, it's nature. It's orienting to these things that allow me to take a spontaneous deep breath and drop into my body. So we're cultivating those practices. You know, this is just a general sort of fawning or not. It's just, I'm growing my sense of self. I'm growing. I did that in part by going on Instagram and saying, I'm not going to wear any more masks and pretend that I have it all figured out. I'm going to just be silly and irreverent and me. And it was like, oh my gosh, like, this feels so good. You know, oh, here I am. Here I am. Oh, I'm allowed. I'm allowed. Right. So there's just listening to the nudges. What are you really interested in? If you had to say, where would you say that you wanted to go for dinner instead of saying, whatever you want to do is fine with me, right? We start to get curious, like what am I actually interested in? And if I don't know, what am I curious about? Curiosity. I mean, we can all just practice it right now. I think it's one of the biggest keys of all. What am I drawn to? If I could be drawn to something, what would it be? Like, you might have to seriously back it up. Like, if I was a person who had interests, like, I wonder what that might be. So you start growing a sense of self. And then to your point, when we catch ourselves, and I get to do this with my husband all the time and friends, I go, ugh, I did it again, right? Like, or I'll the next day, right? I might have overstepped, and I sort of, I just learned the language of apology and sort of like, can we have a do-over, right? Or I reflexively kind of gave in there, but I've thought more about it, and I'd like to share this additional piece. We let it be a little bit messy, right? And flexible. It's sort of like, this is hard stuff, and it's a daily practice, but it's this practice of growing our sense of self. And then it's this practice in safe places first, ideally. You don't go for, your number one abuser, like, here I am, and I'm going to tell you how I feel, right? It's like, ooh, small, safe steps, because we don't want to re-traumatize ourselves. And we're building the sense of safety over time. So start small, start with manageable, like, where do I want to go to eat? That might be easier than like, hey, that really hurt my feelings. Yeah.
I'm going to let you.
Go ahead, babe.
I was listening to you, and I wanted to bring it back. Two things that I just want to touch on with everything you just said. I don't remember where you were, but I was listening to you talk about the hand on the heart, and we're really big into the somatics whenever we bring it to the body, whenever we're getting out of our head and into our bodies. And like that, where you touch, where you focus, attention goes. And you mentioned that. I'm like, yeah, heart all the time. But you said like the skin to skin and how you can release your own oxytocin with that.
Yeah.
I'm driving and I'm like, hold on, I've never heard. So I'm like waving my hand in my shirt driving, and it happened. And I was feeling that. And it was just like, oh my gosh. And it was
head to toe. That's amazing.
I just encourage anybody to try that. And even if like, cause no matter the shirt, I just don't think I had that complete awareness. And also with this work, when you start to, like you say, when you start to recognize it, you can see it more. So you're like, oh, that's what that feeling is. Oh, I am supporting myself. I am soothing myself. I can feel safe in my own body. And it's just those little things where you start to build upon that. It felt so good.
I love that so much. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah.
Thank you for that. And then you said something, and we've been really working with curiosity and how just getting curious about things and how everything that's coming, I don't have to have the answers. I don't have the answers.
Yeah.
And it's so nice to not think I have to have them anymore. Like, I don't know.
Right.
Let's figure it out.
Right.
The curiosity and what it's leading, and how, when you were just saying that, I immediately heard the phrase that we hear when we're a kid, or I heard, it's the common curiosity killed the cat. It's like they're right off the bat squishing that out of you. Don't be curious. Don't be curious. And instead it's like, actually, let's get curious about everything. Let's get curious about everything.
We have a new podcast sponsor, and it's one that I'm really excited about. It's Nutrotonic, and they make authentic Himalayan Shilajit. I've been aware of Shilajit for several years, but hesitant to try any of them because there's a lot of fake ones on the market. But when Nutrotonic reached out and wanted to partner with us, I thought I'd give it an honest try. Well, I've been using it for several months now, and I have to say I love it. Nutrotonic is the only brand to sell rare red Shilajit, which is the most healing, it's high in fulvic acid, and it's the most effective type of Shilajit on the market for boosting testosterone, blood circulation, and overall balance of your hormones, all of which reduce common intimacy issues like ED, low libido, and can even help with menopause symptoms. The other cool thing about Nutrotonic is their Shilajit comes in a couple of different options for you. I went with the resin, which I'm a huge fan of. They've also got drops and gummies. Right now, listeners of the podcast can save 15% on anything at their website. Head to the link in our description and be sure to use promo code Steph and Craig to get that 15% off. Nutrotonic, authentic, rare, red Himalayan Shilajit. Give it a shot. You're going to love it.
It makes me so sad to recognize that, how our curiosity is also sort of snuffed out, because the beauty of trauma healing is that no one can tell you, right? I can tell you this thing on the heart, it really works for me. And this is the thing I do with a lot of clients, and it's really helpful, and you can try it. But so many times I'll be working with the client and I'll make a suggestion and they'll go, nah, right? Like, yeah, it didn't really land. But they know that it didn't land. And they know if they try something else that it does. This is the wisdom that we're trying to mine, the bodily wisdom of what does your body tell you to be true, right? And curiosity brings us there, and honesty, right? That's another piece of, I think, healing a fawn response. I talk about, how many times was I sitting with a therapist and they were like, try this thing. And I was like, oh yeah, it's really helpful. Thanks. But meanwhile, my body is like totally checked out. I dissociated 5 minutes ago. I don't even have that language. I'm performing being a good client so they can feel like a good therapist, right? So there's also like, we get our honesty back of being like, I don't feel a thing. And I'm not bad for it. In fact, that's me moving in the right direction. It's me trusting my body's not here. Oh, wow. Okay. Let's figure out if there's a way for you to have more contact then with your body, right? It's a huge pivot, and it allows us more connection with ourselves. So I guess I also just want to say, like, man, there's just a million different tools, and different people will respond differently. It doesn't mean you're doing it wrong. It means if you're listening and you're curious, it means you're doing it right.
I like that you talked earlier about, or described, the Fawn response as a hybrid response.
Mm-hmm.
And the more that you talk about it, and the more that I'm sitting in the space of like thinking about what you're saying and reflecting on our experiences and my experience with it, and also looking at the world and looking at other people. And
Mm-hmm.
I almost feel like we should completely just flip it around to where like the fight, flight, and free should be on the back end of the statement, and the fawn should just be the big overarching thing that everybody's doing to some capacity at all times, because it's so prevalent in, like you were saying, it's not just like these primary relationships with your
Right.
partners or with it's something that I can relate to almost in every single dynamic or every single relationship that I have,
Yeah.
where it's playing out in some regards where I'm, like you said, it's self-abandonment. It's minimizing my needs, my wants, even just that curiosity thing is getting kind of squashed and placating for the other people that I'm trying to, not pretend, but I mean, at times to pretend, but
Yeah, for sure.
to satisfy, to make sure that they're comfortable, to make sure that they're happy, to make sure that all of those things are taking place so that I'm still accepted, so that I'm still loved. It feels, Ingrid, like the coping mechanism. It feels like the nervous system reaction that we're all doing.
Well, it's so adaptive, right? To your point, it's like it works in any situation practically, right? Once you can kind of tune in to like, well, I figured out who you need me to be so that I can feel safe. Who that version is going to be different depending on the environment. And we figure out how to do it. We figure out how to shapeshift. Again, it's not conscious. The body is just making it happen. And so different people would say different things, that I've talked to. Some say that fawning is just a human adaptation. And some are like, no, I can see it in the animal kingdom, right? So, but I do think for sure our bodies have evolved this response to such a point where, and again, it's because we live in these hierarchies all the time, right? Like we prioritize, white bodies, able bodies, neurotypical bodies, rich bodies, whatever, male bodies, all of these things. It's like the body knows when it wakes up in the morning where it is in the pecking order, and that, okay, what do I have to abandon today to sort of get through unscathed? And I guess that's the other truth that feels so important to me, is that the fawn response is a relational trauma response. And here's the other, I guess, issue that I have with some of the people pleasing and codependency language. They've taken some of these behaviors that we do exhibit, right? These are real, and I get it. They can be problematic, but that language has extracted the context. And the problem really is largely the context. But when we extract the behaviors from the context, we now just look bad and dysfunctional, right? It goes back to this thing of like, well, why would you do that? Like, why wouldn't you just take care of yourself? And it's like, well, because I live in a world where that kind of reciprocity has never existed for me. We're not talking about peer-to-peer relationships, right? Or because my job is on the line, right? There's a million different examples. And so when we put it back in a relational trauma context, and we understand more what relational trauma is and what trauma is generally, it's not just the big car crash or the natural disaster, right? It's being invalidated day in, day out, coming to the breakfast table. You say good morning. It's not a good morning at all, right? Your body just knows self-abandon, self-abandon, self-abandon. Putting it back in the context is the piece that allows us to make sense to ourselves, and why that other language always fell flat and just made me feel so ashamed.
How do we do that, Ingrid? How do we put it back into context?
Well, I mean, I'm certainly in this next book, I have 7 clients that just have my whole heart when I even just think about the gift that they have given me. They're allowing me to share their entire story with the Fawn Response. One of my clients I've worked with for over 16 years, like the work that we are bringing to the page to me is so profound. And it's through storytelling where I'm showing, here was the context, right? Here's this client who grew up in Baltimore in the Black neighborhood and was bused to the other side of town to be with the white kids, and what his body had to do to sort of fit in that environment, right? I'm teasing out and showing all these things. This client who, always treasured for her beauty, and, oh, you're so gorgeous. And her body learned early on, my sexuality is my currency. It's the only thing that keeps me safe here. And so she turned to sexual fawning. It's like, I didn't want those sexual encounters, but I wanted to be seen. I wanted to feel like I was entitled to the air that I was breathing, right? And she knew that the ticket to feel that way was to get the approval of whoever the boys or men were in her life at the time. And so I'm really trying to sort of excavate all these different places and spaces so that people can start to see their own experience reflected. So I think that's the magic in healing through community, is that someone shares their experience and you go, well, I know what they're talking about. And suddenly you can see yourself. And so I'm really trying to explore all of those contexts and all of the different ways that the body has adapted, oftentimes for years and years and years as a result.
Would you be able to, when you said sexual fawning, I don't think I've heard that before. And I had a very visceral reaction. I felt my chest get hot, everything just kind of like flush. Would you mind going into that just a little bit, or as much as you want?
Yes. And I guess I would ask, would we be willing to slow that down just with you and I for a moment? Because this happens particularly with every woman that I have said those words, sexual fawning. There is a recognition there. And they go, I know what you're talking about. And so, not to totally put you on the spot, but I'm totally putting you on the spot after you shared the hotness in your chest. I'm interested in, what does that evoke for you, even in addition to the somatic resonance?
Feel my mouth completely dry. It brings up fear and shame. is what it's bringing up.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's interesting. One of the clients in the book, she's the one I've worked with for 16 years. It's almost like we're sisters. I know her inside out. She practically knows me inside out at this point. And when we were working on her story for the book, I brought up sexual fawning. And we realized that in all this time that we've worked together, we've never talked about sex. Because when I asked her early on what her relationship was to sex, and I asked those types of questions, she goes, "Oh no, I don't have any problems there. I like sex. I'm having sex. It's all good." 16 years later, when I utter the word sexual fawning, she was like, "We've never talked about that." Suddenly, she could see, yeah, she likes sex. She was having sex. But how many times was she having sex when maybe she really didn't want to? Or how many times was she having sex but really thinking about the pleasure that her partner wanted or needed and not about her own at all, right? It evokes different things for different people, but you think about our sexuality. And again, if we're talking about fawning is a way to try and get a semblance of power in powerless situations, right? So if you're disempowered, and we all have our experience of that to varying degrees, but I think we live in a patriarchy. So particularly for women, we go, yeah, we're disempowered, but we're told, that your sexuality is where you have some power, right? And so I think there is this piece that can just sort of turn on for us. And again, it's not binary. It's not, I'm saying yes to sex when I don't want it, or no, I'm not. It's this gray area. There's this muddiness in between where when you start to, again, get curious about your own relationship to sex, it's like, wow, how much have I had to prioritize that to meet someone else's needs, right? How many of us have pretended to have an orgasm because we just wanted it to be over? I would say that's an example of the fawn response. I have other clients who pretended not to ever have an orgasm because they didn't want their partner to perceive them as like too horny or too quick or too whatever, right? Whatever the thing is embedded in the behavior, it's sort of like, I need you to be okay. And so I'm going to do X, Y, and Z to make it happen. And where's the self-abandonment in there? Again, that's always that sort of foundational piece of it. So it happens with sex. It happens with money. No, I've got the check. Don't worry about it, right? We spend money if we have it, and we spend money if we don't. All of these different types of literal, and metaphorical currency are also ways that we fawn. I got it. I've got you. I'm a caretaker, right? Don't worry about it. We feel like, okay, I'm okay in this relationship because this is what I'm doing. This is what I'm giving. This is what I offer. And it has to be something beyond just my intrinsic value. Because I was told that my intrinsic value was never quite enough. Let's be honest. It's big, right?
It's really big.
Thank you for, even being willing just to notice the sensation in your body, because I think that's what happens. This light goes on for a lot of people, and you start to think about everything differently.
As the two of you are talking about the sexual fawning aspect of it, I was thinking about how if we were looking at, like earlier, I'm talking about my childhood and how it's framed in such a way where I think, oh, I had a pretty good childhood, right? But then I shift it up and see it through the lens of complex trauma and see all the different nuances on how it was so different. Would it be safe to assume or to say that in some way people are the idea that, because it's not just the car wreck, like you're talking about trauma earlier, where it's not just these big events in life, where it's all of these other little times and places and experiences. Would it be safe to say that a lot of people probably are viewing sex in that same regards, where they don't think of their sexual experiences, or they think about like their sexual relationship or their relationship to sex as being, it's okay, everything's fine. But if we really apply the lens of trauma and fawning and everything to it, turns out there's probably a bunch of trauma in all of those spaces and all of that
That's
experience.
a brilliant explanation. Yes, because even if your trauma isn't sexual trauma, right? Again, we're talking about power, essentially. There are power dynamics in the bedroom, right? So of course it's going to play out there.
This episode of the podcast is brought to you by Heritage Still. When we got married, we combined all of our pans together.
All of our really old, scratched up, crappy nonstick pans.
And we used those for years, right up until the point where we learned that turns out those were probably killing us or giving us all cancer. So we ditched those pans and we went with titanium stainless steel pans from Heritage Still.
These pans can be used on any cooktop. They're oven safe and they're easy to clean.
Heritage Still is located right here in Tennessee. So you're getting American-made, fine, premium cookware for less. On top of that, you get a lifetime warranty.
And listeners of the podcast can save 10% over at Heritage Still.
Their website is heritagestill.us/Steph and Craig. Again, that's
heritagestill.us/Steph
and Craig. Save 10% at Heritage Still. This is a hard part for me because I don't want to get sidetracked. I think it's a really important, significant thing that the two of you just brought up, and that, you know, Steph, obviously you got I felt the visceral reaction when you had it, when she said it. So I'm really grateful that you spoke up and said something about it, because I was going to be like, baby, I think there's something there for you to say or speak or feel. But I also think it's important too that men, because I've talked to a lot of men, I've done a lot of men's work over the years, and I've sat in a lot of groups with men and done a lot of, you know, just being in space with men and expressing emotional things with men. And I think the truth of it is men have a very safe box as well when it comes to sex and the way that they are able to express it, feel it, communicate about it. I'm just curious. I'm going to get more curious about it for myself in regards to what does that look like in regards to, you know, going back and looking at complex trauma in the scope of sex and relationships and my life and my experience. And because I think it's like anything else, right? It's just more information and more awareness and more knowledge, all to kind of help on the healing journey process.
But I do appreciate, I don't mean to say when I say that every woman that I have spoken to has had some sort of a reaction to this, to imply that men don't also have their own reaction.
No, of course not. But it's
but I think you are also right to point out that, you know, Bell Hooks writes about patriarchy in this like extraordinary way. And to look at, even embedded in that word masculinity, is mask. That yes, men have been indoctrinated into a system where this is what you're allowed to be, and you cannot, right? We have different masks that we're told to wear from an early age. But of course they impact us, right? And I think that wearing all the different masks, my clients refer to it differently. I wear different hats, right? I've done the same thing. It's why part of my unfawning journey was to say, I'm not going to go online and just be the, hi, I'm Dr. Ingrid Clayton, right? Because that's a mask, right? But I couldn't also just like, how can I be all of me more of the time? That's the sort of unfawning journey of it. Because anytime I'm wearing a mask, I'm leaving vital pieces of myself out. That's the self-abandonment, right? That's an example of it right there. And at the same time, there's always going to be appropriate times to fawn. There's always, you know, if you're going on a job interview, you're not going to roll in your PJs, right? But it's like, where do I belong on those continuums? What feels right to me moment to moment? And that's where the curiosity can sort of guide us to. But your point about what it's like for men and how it impacts their sex lives. One of the male clients that I have in the book, can I cuss on here? I don't want to offend your.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah, we're full of cuss words.
He was like, you know, I know what it's like. He said,
go ahead.
Talking about the sexual fawning, and he goes, yeah, you mean like when I'm a stunt cock? And I was like, I think that's it, right? That's the very thing. It's sort of like sex wasn't even at his own pleasure or interest. It was another way that he had to perform. And the performance might be different, right? And fawning also is not gendered. It's an equal opportunity, trauma response. If you have a body, you can fawn. And some people find that, they do it with certain people and not others. Some people find it certain contexts and not others. Some people are like, financial fawning. What are you talking about? For some reason, they have really like great boundaries there, but in other areas of their life, not so much. And so, because to your point earlier, it's so pervasive and it bleeds into every single part of our lives, it can look really different for different people. But bringing the curiosity.
Can you say more to that?
Yeah.
Because I think that's an important thing. I know that we mentioned it earlier about, you'll get stuck in black and white thinking and when you're in these kind of spaces and it's got to be really like this or that. But the idea that you can have different reactions with different people at different times. Mm-hmm. And, I know that with us in our relationship, there's been times when we've gone through and like very much been in the same patterns consistently. And then we'll have periods of time when we kind of break free and we're not anymore. And then we'll go back to some things, or it's like we go back to an old coping mechanism, but that coping mechanism has shifted and changed because we're different. Like it's just more to the reality of what healing kind of looks like with all of these things, where it's not just so clear cut. Okay, I understand it this way, and now that's the way that I understand it from henceforth, and then nothing else is going to change my mind, right?
It's not linear, and there's no finish line, right? For me, this is what I believe. Other people might tell you differently, but I'm telling you that I fawned 2 days ago, right? And it captured me, and it felt like I couldn't get out. But in a lot of other ways in my life, I have a lot more freedom. I'm not living in a chronic trauma response 24/7, right? Survival mode. For so many of us, because it became so pervasive, we literally think it's our personality. No, I'm just really nice and I want to do things for other people all the time, right? I became a therapist. Talk about a chronic fawn response. How can I serve you and find my sense of worth through how helpful I'm being, right? It's like, yes, and I'm finding more and more of myself over time every single day. And, I see this with my clients all the time. They'll be sitting with me in the safety of my office or in the safety of our Zoom room. And they will have contact with themselves where they go, I'm here. Yes, I know how I feel. This feels true. This feels right. And then they go out into the world and all that goes out the window. It's literally like they're noticing these different versions of themselves. And they're like, well, why can't I hold on to this stuff? It's like, because the context, it's a relational trauma response. You're building safety in the context of the safe place in my office. And that's amazing. And let's grow it and let's see. And it makes perfect sense that when you go back out to where you feel ever present threat, that all of that new available goodness is not quite as available. And so I see this thing where they go out and they come back and they bring a little bit more of themselves. And it's literally this feeling. And this is one of the stories in my book, is this client who she could feel herself on my couch. She knew she was in a really dysfunctional relationship, but she'd leave and it was like, but he's the love of my life. What was I thinking? Right. And then she would come back and it would be like, oh my gosh, this is so wrong. What is wrong with me? Right. All the shame, shame, shame. And eventually she had this experience where she was sitting on her own couch in her own house, and she could suddenly see, this is not healthy. This is abuse, right? Those two different parts of her started to integrate and become one. And then she was able to take what she was doing in my office into her own house. But it's always a process. And the body is the thing that dictates our timing, right? I have all kinds of opinions on how I'd like things to roll out in my life, and my body's like, right? So it's a process. It takes time. And I also say this, on a scale of de-escalate abuse to raise your self-esteem, de-escalate is going to win every single time. So if the body keeps tilting towards that direction, this is also why I love looking at the animal defenses, right? These are where we can really kind of see the whole fight, flight, freeze, fawn. If you see an animal that's kind of like crouching down, you don't think, gosh, that guy's got a self-esteem problem, right? You go, he's trusting his instincts. I wonder what he's sensing. And so when we notice that all of these behaviors are ultimately the result of a fawn response, we can start to give ourselves that same grace. Not like, gee, what's the matter with me? It's like, wow, I wonder what my body was sensing. I wonder what felt unsafe.
I absolutely love that. The idea that, because it's a lot of what I've been trying to do as well, is just looking at like, oh, this was my body's way of keeping myself safe. So I'm eliminating shame from this idea that I'm broken, that there's something wrong with me that I have to fix. I've got to change fawning because I don't want to fawn anymore. And instead just looking at it through the lens of like my body's natural response to keeping itself safe. And how awesome is that? How cool is that? That I was like really good at it and kept myself really safe all the time in so many different scenarios and so many different moments, right?
That's
exactly I love looking at it through that lens.
Genius. It really, its origins are so genius. And that's what we get to take back when we put it in the landscape of a trauma response. And, right, because it's not binary, it's and we don't want to live in survival mode 24/7, right? Which is what's happening when we're like, but I need safety all the time, right? Because nothing is safe. And again, that might be true for people. So I'm also not here to just take away you're only coping. It's like taking away our skin, right? You're just like, no. So it's a process, it's context dependent. And yeah, we got to get shame out of the way, which is also why, there's a lot of shame about codependency and people pleasing. Even as I open that literature, it's like laden with, you're so controlling. It's like, my intentions were never to control or even please, quite frankly. My intentions were to be as safe as possible in an unsafe environment. So we gotta get all that judgment out of the way. It's just not helpful. You want to keep a fawner fawning, judge and shame them, because they will automatically attune to like, they think I'm doing it wrong. I better shapeshift into become someone who's a little more compliant.
Shit.
Right? Makes me so mad.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. Okay. That's hitting hard.
We do it to ourselves though.
I'm so curious. Tell me like what's like landing.
Just that just speaking on that codependency, like that's a big one. And we're really working on that in the space and just seeing the ways that trying to get in, and what it really comes down to, it's the thing that you're saying over and over again that is just hitting, is that it comes down to self-abandonment, and all these ways, and how much codependency, and it's this just different place on how not only am I like shaming myself for that, but not really knowing that I'm shaming myself, feeling like I'm taking a healthy approach. Like, oh, I'm going to work on this. I'm going to bring in my autonomy, which, like you said, and it's both, but I'm really just like kicking my own ass over here.
Oh my God, you're speaking my language.
And there's also another like aspect of it that is, it's almost a relief if you can make it your fault, because if it's your fault, then you can fix it.
That's exactly right. I talk about that in the book. If I broke it, I can fix it. If it's mine, woohoo, right? And that's why I say, and look at all the things I did to fix it. Okay. Guess how much of it worked? Literally none of it. Literally none.
If it worked, we wouldn't still be doing it.
Oh my God. If we could be quick to forgive and it was effective, fawners practically invented it. Okay. So all of these solutions that we've been offered have kept us stuck, including the self-improvement BS, which is also why I'm never here to pretend that I have all, you want to mine my personal wisdom because I have it all figured out. It's like, oh my gosh, no, I'm just another person on the journey. Can we talk about it like we're real people with actual bodies that are responding without our permission most of the time? Because that's the only thing that allows me to feel normal. That hierarchy, even in mental health, is keeping the structure of power in place.
This episode of the podcast is brought to you by Element 6. E6 is a local company right here in Tennessee, and they happen to manufacture some of the best pickleball paddles you're going to find. If you're just getting into pickleball, or if you're a professional, E6 has you covered. All of their paddles are engineered with advanced technology and some of the latest materials in the pickleball game. They offer free shipping and returns, and right now, listeners of the podcast can save 10% on anything at their website. Head to the link in our description and be sure to enter in the promo code Steph and Craig. Get out there, get on the courts, and come play some pickleball with us. Element 6, premium pickleball paddles for your pickleball journey.
I've never seen that. I don't know how I haven't seen that. That seems so obvious.
I have the answers. Oh, what do I need to do to be good enough? Right? Tell me the way. Embedded in that is the same hierarchy. It's why so many of my clients were like, yeah, Ingrid, I needed you to feel like I was your favorite client, because they're just trying to get that hierarchy a little bit more. And I go, oh, it makes so much sense. So much sense. So rather than asking them to perform, I need to stop my performance of helpful, licensed credentials, PhD, call me doctor, call me Dr. Clayton, right? I've learned more from my clients than they have ever learned from me. I will tell you that right now. They are the genius ones, the vulnerable ones who are willing to just like, open it up so we both can go, look at all the truth. This is unbelievable. Oh my God. Right? Like, yeah.
Ingrid, you've completely shaped my mind, or reshaped my mind, in regards to not just fawning, but like these nervous system responses that we have. Like, I'm celebrating them now moving forward. I'm excited to recognize them, catch them when they're happening, no longer shaming myself. But like the whole idea, like there's a part of me that thinks like, cool, I'll figure out fawning and then I won't ever do it again. Cool, I'll figure out, right. I'm never going to get angry.
Tell me how you did it and we will become bazillionaires. Okay, we're going to bottle it and sell it.
But just the whole idea that it's something that has to be fixed.
I know.
It's not broken. Like, it's working beautifully. Mm-hmm. It's been serving me for 44 years. It's amazing. It's a great, protective mechanism.
And I don't care how hard we try, we're never going to get rid of our instincts. It's like, no. We barely even know how the brain works. How are we going to like weed out our instincts? We wouldn't want to. They're life-saving, life-giving, life-honoring. They're foundational to being in a body. And so we thank them. We go, oh my gosh. Here's the other thing. This is one of the pieces I love about parts work or IFS work, right? It changes that whole lens too of like, where are you broken? Let me root that thing out and get rid of it. You go, no. Let's honor that as a protector and get curious about how it has served you. Then and only then will the protector itself, that part, go, you finally recognize my worth, right? Then it can start to shift in a really organic way where also we retain the gifts that the protector brought. And what we want to do all the time is throw the baby out with the bathwater. Like, oh God, there's some ugly stuff in there. Let me just see if I can get rid of all of it, which we can't. And then more symptoms of complex trauma, right? Well, now I have to, my eating disorder is going to go up and my addiction is going to go up and my like everything, because we're fighting against ourselves rather than looking at ourselves as like this complex system that again did the best that it could to survive its circumstances. And then we go, well, am I that unsafe now? Right? Like, I'm now 50 years old. I am a mother, right? I still feel a lot of the time the way that I did growing up. And then believe me, I carried that out into the world for decades and decades. So these are well-worn grooves and patterns in my brain. But then I can actually, even right now, look at the screen and see my own reflection. I'm like, what is all of this gray hair? Holy moly. Like I've got myself now. I make myself safe. And I'm not trying to convince myself of it as much as I'm giving myself an opportunity to, and look what I did spontaneously. I put the hand, yeah, I feel my own body. I go, oh, I am here. And then I create a little more room for those protectors to step back. It's such an honoring. We have to honor them first.
I'm looking at you, babe. Ingrid, thank you so much. Is there anything else, babe? I know that
everything. Let's just stay on this and keep talking because, oh my goodness, I'm so grateful for you. I'm so grateful. I love the way that you make it safe to be human. You know, just it's like, we don't have to be perfect. We don't have to fear. And you're showing that, like, you going first is such a big deal. And I'm so excited to get my hands on your book, and really the way that you show up and speak the things that I've heard of, where you're talking about your experiences, your journey, is really what is so gravitating towards you. And I'm really grateful for you. I'm really grateful for this time. And again, when can we get our hands on Fawning?
Yeah,
I know it's not out
for
yet.
pre-order now, right?
It is. The pre-order is up. So get your link and order it now. And then it'll be out this fall. So we have to wait just a little bit. But if you're not already following me on Instagram or on my Substack, I'm going to just, keep the conversation going between now and then you'll make sure that you get all the announcements of things of, book tour and all that kind of fun stuff as it rolls out. It's right around the corner. We're going to blink.
We'll put it all in the show notes, and then you're invited back anytime, Ingrid. So like when that book actually comes out, we'll be able to put it up and talk about it here. And we would love to have you back and discussing more of all of these things. Because again, like Steph said, it's just permission to be human and accept ourselves for who we actually are, instead of all of this self-abandonment constantly left and right.
Yeah. Self-abandonment, even by being good, right? And having all the answers, it's still self-abandonment. So I love this conversation. I really appreciated all your contributions and thoughtfulness and, personal responses and questions. I love this. It deepens it for me, and so thanks for inviting me and having me on. I'd love to come back. We'll do it again.
Wonderful.
Wonderful.
Well, we end every episode with a little tagline that we created last year, and we absolutely love it. It's expect the best.
Plan for the greatest.
And we'll see everybody next time.
We got a wild ride. Wait and see, you and me. We were meant to be.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. You've made it all the way to the end, and we are so grateful for you. If you have a moment, you could take time to like, subscribe, and share this episode. It really helps us. And also, if you liked this episode, which you're still here, so you probably did, you might like these clips too. And again, thanks for supporting the Steph and Craig Show. There's new episodes every week. See you next time.